This is Let's Talk Energy, your go-to podcast for smart energy insights. I'm your host, Noah Brenner, and each week I'm bringing you an inside look at the dynamics shaping global energy markets through in-depth conversations with our own Rystad Energy experts, as well as some special guests. In today's episode, we're unpacking the European power sector, a market that has moved from fairly mundane, maybe just a decade ago, to one of the most interesting and perhaps contentious topics in energy. We see Europe's power market at a pivot point as countries integrate an ever rising share of renewable power at the same time as the continent tries to end its dependency on Russian natural gas. But that evolution has not always been a smooth or a linear process. European wholesale power prices have risen by 30% in the past year, and rising energy costs have become a major headache for companies, consumers, and governments. So, can Europe control consumer energy costs while it continues to build out a power system that is cleaner and also less reliant on imported fuels? How can companies navigate this evolution profitably? And are the current business models fit for purpose into the future? And finally, what can other regions learn from Europe as they continue to grow, modernize, and decarbonize their own power sectors? To help us sift through the competing rhetoric, I'm joined from Oslo by Iben Frimann-Dahl, a partner in our advisory business, and by Francesca Bjørnflaten. She's a vice president of Renewables and Power Research in our analysis division. Iben, Francesca, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you.
Well, let's talk energy. So I know this is a topic that we'll be talking about quite a bit at our upcoming summit in London later on this month. But first, I wanted to unpack this idea of European power markets being at a pivot point. Just so we're all on the same page here, what is it that they're pivoting from, and what are they pivoting to? Francesca?
The European power markets are pivoting away from a fossil-based power system to a renewables-based power system. And that means using fossil fuels, that is mainly gas and coal, but also diesel and oil, to using the sun and the wind to produce power. So half of the electricity produced in Europe in 2010 came from fossil fuels, so power plants using gas or coal, right? And 23% were renewables. While now, 15 years later in 25, this number has actually flipped entirely. So we expect that today, 50% of the electricity produced in Europe will come from renewables, while 29% will come from fossil, and the rest is basically nuclear. This actually means that Europe is in a structural shift in its power sector and how it's procuring power and electricity. Using solar irradiation and the wind speeds to produce power and electricity is fundamentally different compared to burning coal or gas.
I mean, there's a narrative that I hear a lot in the US, but also in many other places around the world, which goes something like this. Europe went green and then power got more expensive. But I feel like many people that I talk to in Europe have a very different view of it. And that's that it's this continued exposure, that remaining exposure to fossil fuels, as you pointed out, that's actually what's making power more expensive. And so, which is true?
If we look at the cost of producing electricity, then the cost of producing electricity from solar and wind is not more expensive than coal and gas. So the price for electricity in Europe, and actually most liberalized markets in the world, is set by the marginal cost of supply that you need to pay to keep those generators going. So if you have a gas or a coal power plant, this marginal cost of supply is the price for coal and gas. For solar and wind, it's basically nothing. You don't pay for the sun to shine and you don't pay for the wind to blow, right? So what this means that let's say that we have a certain hour where the electricity demand is met by solar generation, wind generation, and gas generation, then gas will set the price for electricity that hour. But then another hour of the day, we might either the demand has come down that hour, or maybe we have more panels producing electricity from solar panels. Then we might be generating electricity solely from solar and wind, which means that then the marginal price is zero. And I just want to say for all the experts out there, I'm probably oversimplifying it a lot right now, but
Sure.
To a broad context or extent, this is how it works, and that's why Europe is also seeing a lot of negative hours or 0 hours when it comes to the price. But as a consumer in Europe, then most consumers in Europe actually don't pay only the spot price. They pay what we call the retail price. So the retail price is the spot price, the spot electricity spot price, but also additional costs. So supplier costs or it's generally networking costs. That could be transmission costs, metering costs, taxes, and even some governments have imposed the charges to fund specific policies.
I mean, what can we learn from those places? As you pointed out, there are certain places where power is cheaper. There are certain places where power is more expensive. I mean, what can we learn from that? And even please jump in.
I just want to elaborate a bit on maybe what you talked about and also what Francesca said there on the gas prices, because what you asked was or the way you framed it was that Europe went green and it got expensive. But if we look at what really happened in the 2020s and the power price crises that we've been through, they have mainly been caused by the price of gas. So just to provide two examples of that, if we look to 2021, the market experienced something that has been called the perfect storm. And the reason for the perfect storm was that the market was hit by a crisis both on the supply side with lower supply and higher demand. And just to give some examples of that, 2021 was a year with lower hydropower production and lower wind power production, which of course is caused by these the availability, so to speak, of natural resources or how much the wind blows, to put it simply. In addition to that, we saw that there was issues with delivering gas to Europe, and we also saw that we all know that during COVID, power demand was lower. Demand for most things were lower. But during 2021, we saw a recovery of demand. So that recovery in demand hit at the same time as we saw lower supply. And this caused both power prices and gas prices to rise. And then the thing I think that most people remember vividly is, of course, the prices that we saw in 2022 and 2023. And that was caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the fact that we moved away from Russian gas, again, back to gas driving the prices here.
Well, and that idea of the pivot point as well, of pivoting from Russian gas and that base fossil and pivoting towards a greener system, a more renewables-based system. But I mean, I've talked about Europe's power system as if it were homogeneous, but is that necessarily accurate? I mean, how different are the power generation stacks across Europe, and is it okay because to speak of it as homogeneous because there are so many interconnections, or is it more variable within that total market?
Yeah, it's very variable. So the
Okay.
generation stack within Europe, you cannot really talk about Europe as one power market, because the generation stacks, as you so nicely put it, can be very different from country to country, but not just country to country, but also from province to province inside that country. So there are a lot of regional differences, and I can mention a few examples. So
Mhm.
Spain has such a cool power mix, and I know that's probably the wrong word to use, but it's so interesting because the mix is mixed basically. So they have coal, they have
Yeah.
gas, they have solar, they have wind, and they're also like a peninsula, a bit on the outskirts, only connected to France. They have gas pipelines connected to Africa. So Spain is a super interesting power market as such. But then you have its neighboring country, France, and France is it's the biggest nuclear country in Europe. And just last year, 67% of the electricity that they produced came from nuclear reactors. So that's very different. Now we can move towards the north. So Norway, completely different, almost 100% hydro powered. And then Italy, not the least. Italy is very gas dependent. They're probably the most gas dependent country in Europe, and they were really struck hard by the invasion of Ukraine, because prior to the war, 40% of that gas was Russian gas, and so that crisis really hit hard on Italy, probably like the hardest on Italy compared to the other European countries, and it basically went to that degree that the government asked for a collective effort of decreasing demand of electricity. And I actually know this because I'm Italian, so I have Italian family, and I remember very vividly, basically, being with them on the phone, and they said, "Oh no, we only have 18 degrees inside, so we all need to wear like big jumpers." Because they were all, in this kind of collective effort, and it worked. Coming back to your original question, then no, it's definitely not the same. So we shouldn't really talk about Europe as one power market, and that also is reflected on the pricing. So the reason why we have different prices, different Europe, is because it's not a free flow of electricity from one power market to the other because of the power lines having different capacities.
But I think also, a lot of people, when they talk about renewables, they talk about, okay, so what's the share of renewables in a country? Is it mainly, as Francesca pointed to, is it a gas-fired power mix, or is it a renewables-based mix? But these technologies are also very different, which I think a lot of people, maybe some understand, some don't, because if you start maybe on the cost side, the cost of solar and offshore wind are not the same. And we've talked a lot about the cost decrease, but I think a solar plant, if you calculate it, we usually use the term LCOE, levelized cost of energy. It just means the cost per energy unit produced. And even though a solar power plant on average produces less per installed capacity than an offshore wind plant, it costs about half in terms of LCOE. So that's one thing. But I think an even more important thing is the production patterns. So the way or what you get out of it, not in total megawatt hours, but how predictable is that production pattern? Because the sun usually, at least in the right countries, it shines every day. So you get this very predictable pattern where you get peaks during midday and nothing during night. While the wind, as most of you know, is very unpredictable. So it changes by day, by week, by season. So you can't really plan it in the same way. And that's why where you install it also matters. Installing solar in Norway, I'm Norwegian, so that's a clear example for me, compared to Spain, also impacts that because the weather is different, the climate is different.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about that technology and the supply chain that's providing that technology. I mean, this pivot that we've talked about has been enabled by access to cheap, clean tech from China primarily. As well, Europe is trying to build up and maintain in some areas build up its own supply chain, its own capabilities. And so, is there a risk that if Europe is trying to disentangle itself, as the US is as well, perhaps from China and from those trade dependencies, that this could impact the pace and the scope of the changes that we might see moving ahead?
Right now, Europe on its own don't have a big enough solar supply chain to provide for its own market. So if you want to really install solar panels, which a lot of governments do, because a lot of governments basically want to reach targets, net zero, decarbonize, and so on. If they want to procure more clean power, they need to look for China for that solar supply, basically. And China has really made solar cheap, so the cost for these panels have really come down, and they are serving a global market. And just to come back to Iben's point about how solar and wind inherently are very different, this is not the case with wind. So the Western original equipment manufacturers, Vestas, Nordics, GE, Siemens Gamesa, they basically are now trying to provide mostly for the Western market. So they look to Europe to provide for Europe. So and the costs have not come down at all in the same way. You can't really compare that to solar or even battery energy storage systems, really. So they are inherently very different supply chain wise. Yeah.
But I was wondering, I mean, if Europe is not necessarily able to build up all of the capabilities, all of the supply chain that it needs to continue on this transitional path, I mean, is there a risk that essentially countries that are trading one dependency on imported fossil fuels for another dependency on imported clean tech, imported equipment. Even?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. That there is kind of a we are inherently dependent on other regions, no matter what. So the question is really: do you want to be dependent on the supply of equipment? So as we talk about a lot, we're moving to a more equipment-based energy mix, meaning that you see more of this mass manufactured renewables from a more fossil based, where we haven't had enough fossil fuels to supply our own power mix. So we have always been and will continue to be dependent on other regions. And the question is kind of what's an acceptable level for either of those.
Very, very good point, I think. And I want to talk about how I want to explore how companies are responding to this. I mean, utilities used to be thought of as maybe large, kind of, I'll say, lumbering companies with fairly simple regulated business models, but those also led to, maybe lower but dependable returns. But that's not necessarily the company that is going to thrive in today's market. And so, why do these strategies need to change? And then let's talk a little bit about what those strategies, the successful ones, might look like in the future. But first, let's start with the why. I mean, why isn't that necessarily fit for purpose anymore?
Yeah, I think maybe we can start by taking a step back and just explaining in the simplest form what a utility is and what the business model is. And again, we're simplifying a bit, but a utility basically is in charge of producing, distributing, and selling power to consumers. So that's what they do. And that used to be based on very kind of predictable both production patterns but also to a larger extent also consumption patterns, because as most of you know, power needs to be consumed and or sorry, produced and consumed at the same time, unless you have a good storage medium. So it's what we in Norwegian call ferskvare. So it's kind of that used to be very predictable, and it was based on sources, power sources that you could control, and that had an OPEX, a price that was kind of higher, so that helped to set the price. But what we're seeing going forward is that these production sources, so take solar and wind again, are becoming both more unpredictable and also they're not as flexible, or you can't control them in the same way. And in addition to that, we've seen that this actually leads to these hours of negative prices and have caused or had lower capture rates. And I can just explain that term for those of you who don't know it. And it's really just the kind of price compared to the market price that the asset is able to obtain when it's producing. So over a certain period of time. So with that, margins for these utilities have really been dropping, and that's made it harder to survive in this market.
Okay, well, how could utilities respond to this? What does a successful business model, what might that look like moving ahead, and how might that shift from what we see perhaps today or what was prevalent, say, 5 years ago?
Yeah, I think there are many things that we're seeing utilities do today to adapt to this market of tomorrow. So I can maybe just point to a couple of examples of what they're doing. So we can maybe just start on the production side, where a key word is diversification. So combining these renewable assets that are, as I mentioned, not flexible, or you're not able to control them, with storage mediums. So take it batteries or gas assets, which are flexible, inherently flexible. So that's kind of one thing that we're seeing them do to find complementary sources on the production side. On the other side of the value chain, we're also seeing that some utilities are targeting specific clients or client segments, which might give them more predictable or higher returns, basically. So that could be, for example, data centers, which is a segment we've talked a lot about over the last years. So basically getting a power purchase agreement from a data center producer and being able to know what your return or what the price you're getting is. So that's another one. In addition, I also want to mention one thing that we hear more and more of, and that is in terms of the capabilities that utilities have and are taking advantage of. So trading in this market to be able to maximize the output from assets or portfolios that you have and adapt to the volatility. Having a good trading department or the trading capability internally is also something that we're seeing utilities using more and more.
Interesting. So flexibility, diversification, trading, finding value-added markets, all things that can help provide resilience and successful operations into the future. And I do want to talk about that future and think about what we can learn from what we've seen in Europe and how it might be or may not be applicable to other power markets as they go through, as they see higher renewables rates. And so, I mean, what features or challenges that we've seen that we've talked about today perhaps might be more universal that we might see in other parts of the world as their power markets evolve, and which ones maybe are more endemic to Europe? I mean, how much can we take what we've talked about today and apply it to other places?
In one way, Europe is not unique. It's just the first mover. So I'm not saying that this green transition or the shift towards a greener power mix is only happening in Europe, because that's definitely not the case. But I think as a region, we're kind of a guinea pig in many ways on some things. So that's kind of one aspect to it. And then you can, of course, turn to different kind of characteristics that the European market has on the consumption side, on the production side. I spoke a bit about how weather and climate impacts different technologies. So there are, of course, unique things about the European market, but I think also there are many kind of similarities and many things that we'll see in other regions as well.
But if I may shoot in there, so what is maybe a bit new, or what kind of makes Europe stand out, is that Europe now has more and more countries which has a higher and higher penetration of renewables as part of their power mix. So there will inevitably be kind of bottlenecks or challenges, errors, like a trial and error that will happen in Europe, which of course the rest of the world can learn from. And maybe, like, the worst case, the most extreme example is the blackout in Spain that we saw in May. And I'm not saying that this was a fun experience, but it was, of course, very interesting from a power perspective. And there, as soon as this happened, so for those of you who are not aware, basically back in May, the Spain as a country, well, we don't actually know what happened still exactly,
Mm-hmm.
but they experienced a blackout lasting for almost a day, from midday to almost midnight or late evening. And actually, we had a lot of our employees in Madrid that day, including our CEO, Jarand, who I know have been on this podcast earlier. And they were in Madrid that day, and that of course was a very interesting experience. But basically, as soon as that happened, the blackout happened, there were loads of experts and non-experts speculating as to, okay, how could this have happened? And many of them looked at the high, basically, share of solar, specifically solar, being into producing electricity at the time. But we don't think that we can basically base it solely on that. There were also other factors that happened at the same time. There were some conventional power plants that didn't meet expectations. There might have been something on the grid. I think there basically was kind of like, let's say, a perfect storm to make that happen. But we don't know yet. And I think there's basically an investigation going on. And I think sometime next year there will be an official report, basically. So if you are a transmission system operator outside of Europe, outside of Spain, you will read this report. That will be a lot to learn from that, definitely.
It'll be required reading when it does come out, and so certainly that event, perhaps as you said, a systemic failure rather than necessarily pinpointing one part of the system. But I think that's a really good place to wrap up the conversation. Francesca, Iben, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Noah.
Let's recap. Europe's power market is changing rapidly as renewable sources gain market share, but prices are still largely set by those of coal and natural gas. Power producers and utilities will need to adapt their business models to become more flexible, more diversified, and to try to capture customers willing to pay a premium for their power, such as data centers. And the shifts that we're seeing in Europe are playing out across the globe in many countries, some of which will have the same dynamics at work. But each system is unique and will come with its own set of challenges as its power system shifts. Thanks for listening to Let's Talk Energy. This podcast is a Rystad Energy production, produced by Laura Rodriguez Skaug and Både. Check out the show notes for further analysis on the topics we've discussed today, and connect with us on social media. We're at Rystad Energy on all your major platforms. While you're there, leave us a review, hit that like button, and subscribe. You can also keep up to date with us on our website. If you'd like to send us questions or perhaps a suggestion for a future show, you can email us directly. It's podcast@rystadenergy.com. And don't forget to join us next week on Let's Talk Energy.